All right.
And I'm going to give a very short introduction of Niels. So I'm very pleased today to welcome Neil Collins from Oxford University. Niels is a pure product from Oxford, actually. He did a bachelor, master, then a PhD under the supervision of Matthew Wolfers. Niels published his first paper as first author in Science, which was a good start as a PhD student. His work is combining neuroimaging, in particular fMRI, behavioral experiments, together with computational modeling. And he used this to study choice behavior, in particular in contexts that involve inference learning and exploration, which is important in environments that are both changing and uncertain. So he's going to give us today an overview of his recent work on the topic. Thank you very much, Niels.
Thank you very much for having me. So I'm interested in planning, motivation, decision-making, mostly in humans, but I've also been working a little bit with macaque data. So it's going to be mostly neuroimaging, but there'll also be some causal manipulations in there in macaque model. So to give you a little bit of context, obviously a lot of thought has gone into trying to understand how we make decisions and how our brains make decisions. And the predominant framework here was this one, where you have two or more concrete options in front of you, like this bowl of ramen and this burger. And you solve this decision problem by first identifying the dimensions of value, such as flavor and texture, and then integrating these dimensions into one universal currency and picking the option simply of highest value. And this is so-called neuroeconomic framing and has been very successful for understanding how we use probability, how we might discount delays, and how we might think about effort and so on. But my career, I found myself in this position of again and again trying to say there might be other kinds of decisions you might make in life, and particularly animals are not very frequently faced with consumer preference style decision in a restaurant. So in our daily life, for example, you might be at home and might try to decide how to plan your day. You have to decide where to go, how long to stay there, when to leave, all at once. So there's a sense of this temporal embedding in this longer time frame that you need to consider. And all the while, the environment might be changing, so the movie might start, the restaurant might close. So really, you can't be thinking about one universal value assigned to an option. Instead, you ought to be thinking about time itself. So, and you can see here the reward value of different things. And then in the bottom, the all-important average reward rate, right? So if you integrate and maximize your average reward rate over a long run, you're gonna fare quite well in this kind of temporal extended context. And this average reward rate is a quantity that is very, very important to another discipline. That is ecology and biology, where they're trying to describe behavior in animals in the wild. And that is because it is very useful to try to understand things like foraging behavior. So let's take the cartoon in the top. This is the kind of decision an animal makes all the time. So it is an environment and has to decide whether the environment is rich enough to make search elsewhere more valuable than something it might currently have encountered. So this kind of decision process we've previously linked to the anterior cingulate cortex, highlighted here in red. That's the paper I just referred to. And the reason we argued and we even attempted this is because we believe that this style of foraging decision ought to have a circuit evolved to solve it, because it requires very different information. It requires you to know about an environment, not about a specific option, but about the trends in an environment and how it might be changing and all of that. And then it requires a comparison between two very unequal paths. And then at the same time, the behavior, the output of that circuit of what it might be encouraging you to do is very different compared to this economic comparison between two options that you might like or dislike. But what it also brought me to think about is other considerations that are essential for this kind of temporally extended behavior and foraging in animals that you might have evolved circuits to optimize that are not important if you're just trying to exert your immediate preference of what you want to consume. And to put this in a more modern human example, I often give this, that you should be imagining whether you should leave your job, right? So imagine, like me, you've worked in Oxford forever, and all the equipment is a bit antiquated, and it's sometimes a very difficult place to work. And you're imagining another place, right? All the equipment is new and shiny, the people are enthusiastic and so on. But you know, it is also possible that you end up somewhere even worse. So that's a picture of Cambridge. The equipment is even more antiquated, so maybe you end up there. Or, in fact, right around the corner, there is London, and there's DeepMind and Google, where you might get a job where the AI helps you do your work every day. So all I'm trying to say is you have your job, you have the job market, you know the statistical properties of it potentially, and then you make a sequential decision whether to accept or reject an option. And if you think about it, one of the essential elements determining the value here is your time horizon. How much time do I have to look for the thing I want? So if you saved up a lot of money, you're very frugal, or you have rich parents, you can look for the perfect job forever. But if you are more constrained, you might end up with an even worse offer. So in other words, there's a sense where there's this initial planning decision. How do I engage with my environment, knowing the properties and what you might be drawing in terms of potential offered salaries and your costs you're accumulating. But then I'm also interested in the other process, which is the actual decision sequence, right? When you make the sequence of actions, how are you updating and navigating a changing environment? So we've ran a series of experiments, and here's a picture of an online version of a task. We also did an fMRI where it looked a bit different. So in this version of the task, people have to decide whether to bank the current win. So I have to hit one button to bank, and on the top right corner, that's the number of points they would get. Or instead, they could decide to spin, or spin again in this case, where they would incur a certain cost of spinning, and then deplete one of their possible spins. So we limited the time horizon they have for search. Here they'd already depleted all their spins, so there's a 0, and it hit, the spinner stopped at 40, but it could have stopped at any of the other numbers, and the area of the circle obviously determines how likely it is to stop at that place. So far, so good. So we built a computational model now to try to capture this idea of prospection. So to start off with, we computed the myopic value of search, and that would be the average outcome if I spin once, right? So what's the average value if I spin once? But then to go beyond that, you need to know a crucial thing, which is how am I going to act? Am I going to accept whatever I draw, or am I going to reject it? So in this example, I'm building a tree where I only accept good and amazing offers, and everything else I reject and go on searching again. So I spin again, and spin again, and spin again, until I hit the boundary or deplete all my searches, and I'm stuck with an average of all possible outcomes, or I get what I'm looking for. So now with this tree, you can compute all trees with all possible thresholds and find the one that is best. And that one you can then compute the value of, and that's what I end up talking or referring to as prospective value throughout the talk, right? So I hope this is clear. Throughout, if there's any questions, something not clear, just ask me right away if you want. So here you have this myopic and prospective value isolated by my cognitive model. So the next step is I want to test whether people actually use this information. Can they prospect in the way we anticipate? And are they capable of adapting the value as they go through the sequence of behaviors, right? So if they happen to actually not get what they want and then they go on searching, do they then update or adjust the way they make decisions throughout the sequence, or are they stuck with their initial plan? So to answer the first question, the first thing I did is run a logistic regression where I just try to predict whether people search or accept based on the parameters on the x-axis on the bottom. So obviously there's a massive negative impact on searching if you get a good offer. Why should you search if you get the best thing out there? There's a big impact of costs. If it's costly to search, I won't. And then there's a really nice impact of myopic value as expected, and a nice impact of prospective value. So if the model tells you, if you think into the future, considering that you should search after all, that's when they search. And then we did this other thing. We actually asked them a systematic series of questions after we did the task. And that's also what they report. In fact, they report they would think explicitly 2 to 3 steps ahead. And they would consider winning eventually. And this is kind of nice things to ask people, because it's good to fit a logistic regression to see what behaviorally affects behavior, but it's also good to know what they think they are doing. It's kind of an interesting piece of evidence, I think, that they're explicitly thinking ahead, not just implicitly simulating. But the other thing I can do with my computational model is I can link the regressors of value to brain activity using fMRI. And that's what I've done here. Myopic value strongly activates the anterior cingulate, as did foraging or search value in a previous study. But now the key entity is prospective value. And that also activates the dorsal ACC, and both of these also activate dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And some of you might know dorsolateral and dorsal ACC are heavily anatomically connected with each other. So we thought, well, from all what we know about dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, maybe when it comes to thinking ahead and about the future, there needs to be an interaction between dorsolateral and dorsal ACC. So to test this using imaging data, we did what's called a PPI, or physiological psychological interaction analysis, in a time course, finding that there is a marked increase in connectivity between these two brain areas when there is a lot of prospective value, but not when there's myopic value. And myopic value is a really nice control regressor here because it equally activates both brain areas, right? So both activate the brain areas, but only prospective value fuels or drives an increase in functional connectivity here. So that's all very interesting. It's about the initial prospective value and planning. But what also is very interesting about this paradigm is that there is a sense of once you are going through the tree and making a sequence of choices, you need to adapt. And the way you need to adapt or update the value of searching is plotted here. So you start off before you've made a search with your pure prospective value, but then as you commit searches, your prospective value goes down. And that is because the number of opportunities you have to draw the item you want goes down, right? So the value of going on searching slowly but surely decays. And you can encapsulate the rate of decay by computing the average change per search. And that's encapsulated by the red line below. But first, we can prove behaviorally people update value. So they don't just take the initial prospective value and count here. If I look at only the later searches, you can see as the value collapses, they become less likely to search. And that's also what they tell us. They tell that they would start accepting things once they had spun a couple of times they would have rejected initially. So it's very nicely can show something about sequential context that is very interesting about how you need to reassess and update your decision strategy very rapidly. And the fact that you need to adapt your decision strategy rapidly made us think that there might be an anticipatory signal of the rate at which you know you will have to change the way you choose in that sequence. And that's what you can see here in pink, in fact. So at the initial planning stage, you can see again in green the prospective value, but you can also see as the brain anticipates having to stop searching in a couple of steps, you get the pink activity in pre-SMA area 8M9. And that's a double dissociation between both brain areas that we were quite excited by, because we can see on two very different time scales adaptive signals dissociate here. And a lot of imaging decision-making studies, these two brain areas would activate together, and we have found quite a clean dissociation here, which is kind of interesting. But it's all correlative evidence, right? So far, I've told you about one imaging study. What we would like is a bit of causal evidence. So I was part of the macaque experiment where we could get some of that causal evidence. But because it's a macaque experiment, the experiment itself looks a bit different. It wasn't like as complicated. So what the macaques had to do is there's these images 3 of them, in fact. And in every trial, 2 of them would be presented to them, and 1 was hidden. It wasn't available to be chosen. But every trial, it could be a different tool. They had to learn the value of each of these, the probability, in fact, in this case, and choose accordingly. And the framing we went with is that we looked at the neural signals at first using functional imaging in the macaques as well, of chosen item and the best alternative and the worst alternative, independent of whether it was available in the current trial. And the reasoning here was that it was about the counterfactual reasoning or the hypothetical thing about the future. It was, what would I pick? What could I be picking next time around? What would be the best thing I could be doing if I'm not doing what I'm doing? So it's a bit like with a foraging, where you engage with something and thinking about what else could I be doing, okay? So that's why we thought it's very equivalent in some ways to what I taught to you earlier. And in fact, what you see is here in the macaques on the far left, activation that mimics this thinking about the best alternative. If the value is very high, you get a lot of activity. And in the middle, you can see a time course analysis just showing the same thing again, breaking it apart to best alternative, which activates ACC, and chosen value that deactivates it. But I would like to highlight and bring to your attention, most of all is the thing on the far right side, which is if you use transcranial ultrasound stimulation. That's a you might not have heard of it. It's a relatively modern stimulation technique, which is currently being tried also in humans, that allows you to get to medial deep brain areas non-invasively. And what you can see here is that when you stimulate or interfere with ACC, they become less likely to switch into the best alternative in a future trial. Whereas normally, when they switch, they normally pick the best alternative. After TOS, they randomly pick between the 2 alternatives as they switch, right? So that made me believe that there's something about prospection and thinking about your best alternative courses of actions and anterior cingulate activity. But another thing that we wanted to do is look at the way different people do this task differently, because it's a very complicated task. My original search task, sequential search task, is quite complicated. There's many different ways you could assert your individual preferences. And one thing you might be doing in this task is, because you're planning ahead about future actions, you might be a bit like Odysseus. You know you're not going to be able to forego temptation, like with the sirens here, so you constrain yourself. You're not even putting yourself in an environment where you might make a wrong decision. So first, we wanted to see whether we see that kind of bias in participants. So what we can see is, when they go through a sequence of actions and update their value, they also have a massive bias. In fact, if they've already committed searches, they're way more likely to go on searching. So it's a bit like they're putting themselves in a situation where they run on too long. And about half the participants that we asked in an earlier sample were aware of this. They knew that they may have this problem. So what we wanted to understand is, are there real life or clinical links that are connected with this kind of behavior, and among other things. So what we did is we collected a massive online sample, about 450 people, and then we collected another confirmation sample of 700 people after that. And what we wanted to do is this. So we collected loads of questionnaires and did a dimensionality approach, where we identified in our sample 4 dimensions that are relevant: compulsivity, apathy, depression, anxiety clustered as one dimension in the sample, and social anxiety. But the most important one for this study was compulsivity and apathy, because they had interesting impacts on behavior. So as I said, people had awareness of decision in inertia. So this idea of going on too long. So once you made a decision to search, you go on searching, even though you shouldn't. But they also had this interesting self-report of chasing. So that's slightly different. It's saying, well, I went on because I wanted to get this big payout. They're like going on because I want this really big thing in the wheel, even though they know it's not good. So what we find is that compulsivity, the clinical dimension of compulsivity, means people report to be chasing more. But what was also appealing, because we have this mixture, we have questions about what they think they're doing, but we also have our regression model where we can really look at what parameters, what element of a task is the behavior sensitive to. And what we found there is that compulsive individuals are less sensitive to incurring costs. They just go on searching, even though there might be a cost to it. And the way we analyzed it on top is using a mediation analysis, where we found that what links to the self-report of so what links to the behavior of cost sensitivity is the report of over-chasing. So if you are very insensitive to cost, you experience that you are over-chasing. You go on too long, but you do it in a motivated way. And that, in fact, fueled another factor I haven't told you about, which is self-report of preemptive avoidance. These are the very same people who argue or say they actually try never to or search less in the first place. They try to avoid environments where they would end up not being sensitive to cost and then overchasing or experiencing overchasing. So we found this interesting fact about the compulsivity dimension, that they would preemptively avoid entering environments where they might go on for too long. But the other really exciting thing what we found is linked to apathy. What we found with apathy is where normal people search and stop when they get something good, apathetic individuals ended up searching repeatedly and more rapidly after a while. So as with already searched, they search quicker and are more likely to continue searching. And that was actually surprising to me. And we since replicated the decision effect in the confirmation sample that I would have intuitively thought an apathetic individual wouldn't engage with searching because it's effortful, right? If you start searching, you have to make more decisions, the trial takes longer. But instead of that, once they've committed to a decision, they just go on longer. They are inert to change the way they make a decision more than they're inert towards making more actions. So we could dissociate here that rather than having an action inertia, they have a decision inertia. So it seems to, or you can argue then that the most effortful act in our paradigm is to reassess the way you make decisions and change the way you choose in that sequential context. So just to summarize this prospective sequential study, I hope I've convinced you that there is something interesting about how dorsolateral and dorsal ACC interact in terms to compute prospective value, and that there's other types of value representations that allow you to quickly adapt as you go through the sequence in adjacent dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. And then there's something interesting about the insight people might have to some of the things they're doing, and how the things they're doing in this task differently than others might be linked to real life differences and clinical traits they might have. So far I told you a lot about decision-making and how in foraging and ecological decision-making and temporal extended decision-making, it's really important to think about the future and make choices based on that. But what I neglected to mention is that a lot of real-life environments are dynamic, right? They just change over time. They're not static. And if you know the dynamics of a reward environment and you can exploit it, that's really, really useful in the wild. And anyone that has played in the ever been in the stock market or checks COVID numbers very regularly knows how strong our urge is to extrapolate. You see a curve and you try to extrapolate, right? So it stands to reason that because in real life environments, autocorrelations are very common. There is information to be had in tracking reward rates over time, but we don't really understand how we're doing this, right? So here the example of a green curve going up, a blue curve being stationary, and a red curve going down. We don't really know the neurocomputation underlying this understanding of a trend, not just average value. So we had this idea that maybe one way you could implement such a trend computation is by lining up neurons with different learning rates or time constants, right? So if you have a neuron with a very short memory and it says this environment is amazing, but a neuron with a long memory says it's not so good, that's an environment that's improving. Versus an environment where the short timescale neuron says, oh, this is crap, and a long timescale neuron says, no, I remember it used to be really good, that's an environment that is potentially going down. So you can compute a derivative or reward trend very easily by just having neurons with different learning rates. So the first thing we try to say is there even evidence in the human brain that there might be a spectrum of learning rates? There's an electrophysiological study in macaques showing that there might be, but we wanted to see whether we can see diversity of learning rates in the human brain on a more macroscopic scale. So what we did is we took data that had already been published a while ago from Behrens et al. And reanalyzed it. So in that task, what happened was you had to pick between two cards, the blue and the green. In every trial, there would be randomly a number assigned to each, and that's the magnitude you get, and the color tells you the probability. So they need to learn probability and see the magnitude. And they just had to pick the better gamble. And the reason we took this data set is because it has very clean and nice data about reward learning. And the other reason we picked it is because it had a modulation of what they call volatility. So the rate at which the probability changes. And when it changes very quickly, you should learn very fast. If it changes very slowly, you should learn very slowly. So you should learn with a different learning rate in different parts of experiments. But the key new thing we did is instead of fitting such learning rates on behavior, we tried to fit these learning rates on the brain. So you literally fit the best learning rate for every voxel. And this is the result of that analysis for the anterior cingulate. And you can see there seems to be a bit of difference between bits of the anterior cingulate. There seems to be a bit of gradient, in fact, along one axis, where the higher learning rates are more anterior and more posterior are the lower learning rates. And there's also gradient in the IPS. So we identified the IPS, and the ACC had a diversity of learning rates. But not just that, we could also see that learning rates that were high, or high fits in an ACC, were functionally more connected to high learning rates in the IPS, even though they are not like anatomically quite distinct and far away. It seemed like there was a preferential functional connectivity between these two, between bits that were learning fast and bits that were learning more slowly. And on top of that, we could show that as you manipulate volatility, the best the best fitting learning rate had a stronger. So if the best fitting learning rate was very high, there was a stronger signal in volatile environment, and that's what you should be reading out in the ACC, but not in the IPS. In other words, ACC signals were enhanced for the behaviorally relevant learning rate as the environment told you you should be learning quick, now you should be learning slow. And you could see if you fitted volatile and stable separately, you could see that the distribution as a whole would move to the right or left for the best learning rate. So really, it was environmentally sensitive. So there was a diversity of learning rate, but it was also slightly flexible. Problem is we can't associate whether it means that neurons change their learning rate or the strength of signal of the neurons with the right learning rate just increased when it was behaviorally appropriate. But what we could show is that it's not the same in all brain areas. The ventral striatum had a beautiful learning rate signal, but that seemed to be invariant by environment, right? So that just seemed to just always tell you the same thing. So now we've established there is some evidence that there's a diversity of learning rates. That's great. That could help us compute a simple trajectory. But we haven't shown that that's what people do, or how the brain could solve this trajectory computation. So that's the next task. So here, very simply put, after about 16 time steps, the thick black line, you have to make a choice. Should I stick with my current environment, or should I leave it for a reference patch? A reference patch has a reward rate highlighted by the red number. It's like stable, and you know it's known. And now, if you look at it, if you learn about trends, you know you should stick with a blue curve and you should leave the green curve. However, very importantly, if you are a simple RL algorithm that just learns about the past with one learning rate, you will never do this because the blue has accumulated so far more reward. And the green had accumulated more reward and the blue had always been less rewarding. And you will ignore that recent trend because that recent trend won't change that. But what we can see is that the anterior cingulate activity signaled very clearly the reward trajectory. So whether things were getting better or worse. And the way it did it is quite interesting. Here you can see the signal modulation by reward as a function of when it was received. When reward was received very long ago, 13 to 15 steps ago, it suppressed the ACC. If it was received very recently, it activated the ACC. And if you add that all together, it equates into computing a trend. Because if you really love reward that was recent but suppressed by reward that is far away, that's really making you compute a positive trend of things getting better. So really, we have now evidence that you could compute simple reward trends with diversity of learning rates that exist in the ACC, and that the simplest reward trends lead to signals in the ACC when you make these decisions. But one thing we haven't done, so these reward trends are very discrete events over longer periods of time. They're not continuous reward trends as animals might encounter in the wild. So another task I ran is to test continuous reward tracking that an animal might make when they're grazing. So in order to do that, we show them this line at a bar height that is changing. And the line tells you how much reward am I getting every second. So you're literally getting, every second you're getting another reward. And you decide now when to leave an environment or not. So the way the environment, and because it was relatively continuous, we resorted to a different method, namely EEG, because that gives you a more temporary resolved signal. So the reward environments, in fact, decayed slowly. They had a specific starting point and then decayed slowly at different rates. And what we did is we also made them learn. So there are two patches they had to choose between, and then they had to stay in a patch for as long as they wanted. And they could leave at specific time points that were probed. So what we manipulated and they had to learn is starting point and decay rate for each patch. And here in black, you can see the true number, and in red and green, you just see numbers based on a Bayesian inference model, and the blue lines are just update signals. So you can see that they had to learn these two numbers, and sometimes both patches were rich, sometimes both patches were poor, sometimes one was good and one was poor. And so throughout the task, the overall reward history across patches would be poor or good. And that was key because in ecological foraging, that's a key quantity of when to leave an environment, is how rich is what you might get in the future and how rich was what I got in the last couple of patch encounters. Because if things are really good elsewhere, you should leave quicker. And if they're really poor elsewhere, you should leave later. And that's, in fact, what we can see. Obviously, the primary driver of leaving decisions, so there's a logistic regression again, the primary driver of whether to leave when you are asked whether you want to leave is reward. If my reward right now in this trial has collapsed, I should leave. But what we've also found is a reward change or a derivative signal. So they're also sensitive to the trend of how quickly things are going down. And they're sensitive to the long-term patch history. And that's not the history in that encounter. That's the history across the last 5, 6, 7 encounters, which are minutes away past. So the way we analyzed this task was slightly more complicated than a simple ERP analysis, because these are relatively internal events that could be time unconstrained, temporally unconstrained, or variable across trials. So in order to analyze it, we used this relatively new method called temporally unconstrained decoding analysis, or for short TUDA. And what this method does compared to standard decoding is it first runs a hidden Markov model to determine in every trial, and that's what you can see on the left, a version of that, and every trial, what is the hidden brain state at that moment in time in that trial. And having done that, it uses that information to decode based on the inferred brain state, not chronological time point. Whereas a standard decoder would decode with the same pattern at 100 milliseconds in every trial. That TUDA algorithm decodes on brain state 2. And brain state 2 might be long in one trial and short in another trial. And that has the advantage of temporally variable cognitive events in the middle of a trial could be decoded better that way. At least that's the theory. So did it work? So first we looked at the reward events as you are in the patch and continuously accumulate reward and it is going down. What neural signals do you see in the brain? So what you see here on the the x-axis is time, on the y-axis decoder accuracy, and the continuous lines in the bottom are significance tests, so it's clustering significance. And you can see very strongly reward seems to be decodable continuously. But at the moment when you're like experiencing reward event and integrating it into your model of how are things going, should I maybe consider leaving, you can see a strong signal of reward derivative or reward change within the patch, and a longer term reward history effect across patches. How rich and poor is my world overall? So you can see these strong signals, but you can also see there's a topographic dissimilarity. If you look at the topography of the EEG, that suggests there might be different neural sources. However, this can't, like, we didn't source reconstruct this, so the next step for me will be running a mega-analysis to actually find the underlying neural source of these signals. But I'm relatively confident that there will be a partial distinction of the source of neural integration, and I hope that the reward history effects will be more prefrontal compared to the current instantaneous reward. But what is also really exciting is, as you leave a patch, you get what's called an aggregate reward. You get the reward of all that you have accumulated during the time you were in a patch. And the reason I think that is very exciting is because in most experiments, 99% experiments people run, you get trial-wise reward. Here you get rewards that could be really high, but if it took you a long time to get it, it's not very good, right? So you should discount your reward by how long it took you to get it. And that's key in a lot of your life, right? If you make €2 in an hour, that's not much. If you make €2 in 10 seconds, that's a lot of money, right? So time is essential for reward, but almost all experiments don't really consider average reward rate in that way. But when we now do that, we can see very strong signals linked to accumulated reward with this parietal topography, at the same time as leaving time, or time it took you to accumulate that reward, occurring at the same location and then somewhat different topography. So it really looks like the brain very rapidly computes the average reward rate rather than just raw reward and then discounting by time. So it seems to be a very intuitive way for the brain to integrate the reward they just received. And on top of that, you can predict when they will leave in the next trial. So like how motivated are they to engage further with their environment or stay longer. And you can also decode the long-term history across patches of how motivated they are to stay longer. So in fact, the accumulated reward divided by leaving time is what this patch reward history is based on across trials. So I hope this is kind of interesting for trying to tease apart the computational mechanisms of how you might track dynamic and changing reward environments to allow you to decide when and how to leave them and move on. But there's more to reward learning than average reward rates, even when they're dynamic. And to exemplify that, I love showing you this picture. And it's probably you will be able to appreciate that quite well. So being a French audience, so this is a picture of a 50s mockumentary where they showed to a British audience that they said this is how Italians make spaghetti. So they're spaghetti trees, and they harvest them from spaghetti trees and dry them in these long racks. And apparently about 60% of British people believed this. They believed after watching this movie, that's how you make spaghetti. And I'm not just telling you a story to mock the British, even though with culinary things it's quite easy. I'm telling you this story because if I'm an RL algorithm, a really simple one, that likes apples as much as spaghetti, I won't generate a prediction error in this scenario because all I care about is expected value, overall utility. But in the real world, that's not true. You care about reward features of things you like when they're surprising, but maybe value neutral, right? So an ecological learner should be really caring about these things, because if you like spaghetti, it's important to know that they grow in spaghetti trees, or well, maybe not. So in order to investigate the idea of value neutral prediction errors and learning about reward features, we did a study in macaques. So this is an imaging study I did together with two graduate students and Matthew, where we had macaques in the scanner, and all they had to do is touch one of two sensors in every trial. It's very, very easy task. So they touch the left sensor when a square appears on the left, you touch the right sensor if it squares on the right. And then you receive 3, 2, or 1 drops of juice. If you make a mistake, very rarely happens, you get no juice. And we manipulated 3 things. We manipulated the visual spatial prediction error. So often it would appear on one side, then surprisingly the other, then it would be the other, and then the other. So there was trials that were visually spatially surprising, but nothing to do with reward. And then most of the times we would give either 3 drops, 1 drop, 3 drop, 1 drop. And that would average out to be 2 drops on average, but only very rarely we would give them these 2 drops, right? So there was positive and negative prediction errors all the time, except the average reward rate was 2 drops, so there should be no prediction error in terms of reward size when you get 2 drops. But that was the key manipulation, because if you care about reward experiences, these 2 drops were confusing, right? They're like, this is nothing that I know, it's something I very rarely experience. That's very surprising. And I was concerned that the animals would not really pay attention to the reward all that much if there was nothing to learn about. So we also had sessions that were volatile to some degree, where sometimes 3 drops were a bit more likely and sometimes 1 drop was a bit more likely. And then we had these stable sessions where that wasn't the case. And so what did we find in the brain? Well, we find what you would expect with visual spatial prediction error. We found parietal and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity, and we found what we expect with reward size prediction errors. We found VTA, very strong ventral striatum activity. So this brain area really cares about whether you get more reward or less reward than you expect. But when you get 2 reward, it's what you expected, so there's very little additional signal. But what we did find for rare 2-drop experiences is orbital frontal cortex activity and some dorsal striatum as well. But what we're particularly interested in is the orbital frontal activity, which is a brain area that we, in the past, identified for credit assignment, inference, and learning. So it's really interesting. But this activity only popped up when we looked at the volatile sessions. So only when you are attending to changing reward, you also attend to things that are reward neutral. In other words, like you paying attention to anything that might happen with the reward that is surprising, even if it's not value linked, when you are in that receptive state. So in other words, while the ACC really cares about how reward trends develop and your environment goes up and down, or anticipating environmental change, orbital frontal cortex engages as a function of thinking about learning new things about the things you might deem rewarding. And that would be really useful to do things like inference and credit assignment, right? So when something is rewarding and something happens with that rewarding thing, you might be able to learn something new about that, right? So you might learn a new causal relationship and so on. So just to wrap up, I hope I've told you something interesting about prospection, adaptation, and predicting reward trends, and the role of the cingulate cortex particularly plays in that, and how that might be a really important thing to solve for the human brain, and how there is these temporal dynamics playing out when you think about dynamic environments that I will pursue further in the future using MEG, but did a little bit with EEG. And then hopefully I convince you that there's even some causal evidence in macaques that ACC plays some role in anticipating what would be good to do in the future, and that all these are ingredients and building blocks that would be really important for more ecological temporally extended decision making, like when you leave your house and you think about how is my reward environment changing, how should I plan my day, and so on. And then at the same time, when it comes to complex learning about your environment, you have the orbitofrontal cortex that engages, particularly if you think there might be something changing or something to learn about my remote environment. And then you have this orbitofrontal system that becomes very receptive to any feature that might help you behave or act better in the future. Thank you very much.